Cities After is a bi-monthly podcast about the future of cities. Grounded in our daily urban struggles, it is part dystopian and part utopian. My intention is to entice your civic imagination into action, because we know that a more just and sustainable urban future is possible. This is Miguel Robles-Duran, and I dare you to imagine our cities after.
COVID, global warming, gentrification,
exploitation,
homelessness, racism,
colonialism,
patriarchal,
hunger,
police brutality,
private property,
Capitalism. This podcast is made possible by Democracy at Work. To start the second season of Cities After, I will dedicate 4 episodes to make sense of the growing suburban divide in the United States, its consequential production of COVID Boomtowns, and the future of Sprawl. In this first episode, I will give a brief overview of the primitive accumulation that gave rise to American suburbia, together with its racist, patriarchal, and capitalist ideologies. This will serve as a basis to understand the contemporary phenomenon of post-COVID sprawl and its social, political, economic, and environmental consequences to the near future of American cities and their inhabitants. All topics that I will touch in the coming 3 episodes. The origins of what we know as American suburbia can be traced to the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s political lobbying of bankers, real estate actors, and the construction industry. All of these enacted as a federal response to the Great Depression and the war-influenced economies, as well as the absolute dominance of racist, patriarchal, and capitalist ideals. In order to better understand these origins, I will give a punctual overview of the key precursors from these decades. In the 1920s, in coordination with the National Association of the Real Estate Boards, President Edgar Hoover's Commerce Department created a division of building and housing in 1921 and went on to establish and support Better Homes in America. By 1930s, this coalition had over 7,000 local chapters composed of bankers, real estate brokers, developers, and related industries who strongly lobbied for government support for private development of individual homes to boost the economy. Later, in 1934, President Roosevelt's Federal Housing Administration began to insure bank loans to private developers with the purpose of helping them purchase and subdivide land. And these loans were allowed to the developers to build single-family houses with very little capital investment. And here we're talking about loans that covered between 80 and 90% of a total project, which obviously in turn eliminated most financial risks for developers to build and speculate as they pleased. As the feminist urban historian Dolores Hayden puts it, for the very first time, the federal government at that time provided massive aid directed to developers, whose loans were insured by the Federal Housing Administration, and white male homeowners who could get Veterans Administration guarantees for mortgages at 4% with little or nothing down, and then deduct their mortgage interest payments from their taxable income for 30 years. Another important federal creation of that period was the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was a government-sponsored corporation conceived as part of President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. Established in 1933 with the purpose of saving homeowners in spiraling financial struggles, as a strategic part of workings, the Homeowners Loan Corporation implemented a neighborhood grading system that assigned a blanket letter grades to assess property values and train home appraisers. The letter A in this grading system was the highest value, and the letter D was the lowest. So A rating was given to upper or middle class white neighborhoods that the Homeowners Corporation categorized as posing minimal risks to banks and lenders. A B rating meant that it was still desirable and was assigned mostly to all white US born neighborhoods that the Homeowners Corporation defined as positive investment for lenders. A C rating meant a declining neighborhood. These were generally areas occupied by working class citizens as well as first or second generation European immigrants. And lastly, the D rating meant hazardous neighborhoods. These were, according to the agency, undesirable areas with undesirable people. Usually neighborhoods where African American, Mexican, and non-European immigrant families lived. This grading system also began to render a new kind of urban map, where A was colored in green, B was colored in blue, C was colored in yellow, and D, the hazardous rating, was colored in red. This color designation gave rise to the planning term known as redlining. Later, these ratings began to be used by the Federal Housing Authority as standards for issuing mortgages. Therefore, neighborhoods considered hazardous were redlined by lending institutions, denying most non-white citizens the possibility of improving their living condition. As a matter of fact, the redlining designation significantly reduced the social and economic opportunities of Black and brown populations by reducing their poverty values and property values, and further stigmatize their neighborhoods and livelihoods, cultures, as non-desirable. While the practice of redlining was prohibited under the Fair Housing Act of 1968, its lasting effect is still very present across American cities and hard-etched in the backdrop of contemporary forms of urban segregation. According to the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, most of the neighborhoods, around 74%, that the Homeowners Loan Corporation graded at that time as high risk or hazardous, 8 decades ago, are still low-income, moderate neighborhoods. And according to this organization, most of the Homeowners Loan Corporation graded as hazardous are areas that continue to have a 64% minority population. Now, let me go back to the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s. It was blatantly clear that the federal policies of these decades were prioritizing the homeownership industry as a way to reinforce private markets and finance of urban development as one of the primary economic forms of recovery from the Great Depression. The capitalist enterprise, from bankers to real estate agents to government officials and landlords, were being rewarded for their investment and speculation in economically well-off white neighborhoods, as well as for their capacity to exclude African Americans, Mexicans, and other minority groups from their plans. Despite all of these racist urbanization efforts and housing reforms, by the end of the Second World War, the US was in deeper housing crisis that was mainly fueled by a severe shortage of housing. Millions of people that worked in the war machine were looking to settle again. This included over 12 million veterans, over 10 million war plant workers that needed relocation, as well as many interior migrations within the United States, such as over 4 million African Americans that had left behind the agricultural labor in the South to pursue factory work on behalf of the war efforts. Also, there was an unusually high bump of birth rates, mainly happened through the coming of younger soldiers and their desires to create family units. And these are the birth rates that we now know as the baby boomers. And young families needed homes. And thirdly, I think it was that the construction industry was in a very bad shape. Most of the economic efforts and economic concentrations had to do with the supporting of the war machine, and thus construction industry was not at its best at that time. A report from the U.S. House of Representatives in February 1946 declared the following: it's a national emergency because of the critical housing shortage. The report mentioned that existing facilities are inadequate to house large segments of the population and large numbers of veterans that are returning to civilian life in need of housing accommodations, which are obviously not available. That House report also mentioned that it was estimated that some 2.9 million married veterans of the recent war will be in need of housing facilities by the end of the year 1946. And to meet the housing emergency, there is an urgent need for some 3 million moderately and low-priced homes and apartments during the next 2 years. Obviously setting the stage from 1946 to 1948 to create and to develop all the political support mechanisms to enable this massive housing boom. If this wasn't an enough urgency, I meant the creation of this House report, there was another report from the Senate that warned the following, and I quote: "If Americans ever lose faith in the free way of life, it will not be because they have been converted by totalitarian arguments, but because vested interests within the democratic system raise intolerable barriers to the satisfaction of popular needs. The lack of decent housing with economic reach of all American families may once have been a national scandal, and now it's a national tragedy." I end quote. This was a Senate report. So, prompted by the urgency of the problem, several ambitious housing programs were launched around the country. But those housing programs were immediately attacked by right-wing politicians as socialism. These right-wing attacks to public housing, to any form of collectivized housing, were amplified by the Senator Joseph McCarthy in the Senate hearings on housing of 1947 and 1948, where he famously called all kinds of public housing a breeding ground for communists. In support of McCarthy's rhetoric, Herbert Nelson, which at the time was the president of the National Association of the Real Estate Boards, also declared publicly that housing as a collective or how public housing was communist. In no time after those declarations, most leaders of the American housing industry were in sync with this line of thought. Public housing was socialist, public housing was communist, collective living was part of that. So McCarthy and his supporters were instead asking the government for a proper capitalist solution to the housing crisis. This meant public money for private developers and to let the free market do its miracles. In unison, McCarthy and all of these people began to rally against affordable housing and any proposal that opposed the private market. To make their voice even stronger, McCarthy's committee also focused their vicious attacks to worker unions, labor association, women's workers that were proposing collective solutions to the crisis. It is thought that the political thinking behind this kind of support also had to do with the non-permitting of workers' associations, meaning that through a form of capitalist development that was more catered towards individualized forms of living, they would not permit the creation of associations, of collectivized gatherings, and somehow atomize the workers into their own housing stock. For these hearings, McCarthy found the unconditional support of famous developers, Alfred and William Levitt, who testified for him that the only way to solve the housing crisis was through the release of large federal aid to large private developers and the promotion of non-unionized construction workers, as well as changes in zoning laws that favored large-scale development, and obviously the elimination of outdated land restrictions or restrictions on land. The Levitt brothers and Senator McCarthy worked together to promote Levittown as the true American capitalist alternative to all kinds of Soviet, European, socialist, and communist propaganda, housing models of collectivity and publicness. According to them, communist models promoted collective solidarities. What the Levitts proposed promoted individualism. Each family unit separated in its own piece of land, consuming and providing just for themselves. To quote William Levitt, "No man who owns his home and a lot could be a communist. He will have too much to do." End of quote. So the Levitt Brothers Alliance paid very well. By 1952, Levitt and Sons of Long Island was America's largest home builder. From 1947 to 1951, they had created the first truly mass-produced suburb, which consisted of over 70,000 individually separated family houses with planned efficiency that they had modestly named Levittown. Without doubt, and historically it is considered, that this became the archetype of what most of the world now refers to as suburbia, or even more precisely, the American model of suburbia. What most of the world does not know is that this suburbia, as well as being strategized from the very beginning as a political-backed capitalist enterprise, with all the traits, ideals, and intentions of the times, that consisted of extracting money for private development, became the primary business. Thus, the act of housing people was secondary to high profit yields for the elites, and obviously the promotion of new mass patterns of consumption. The Levitts were receiving millions of dollars from the Federal Housing Agency, but they continued to lobby for less regulation and weaker housing standards that could permit even more profit. At some point, William Levitt publicly said, and I quote, "Utopia in this business would be to get rid of the government, except in its proper function of an insurance agency." End of quote. The Levitts had brought the division of labor specialization into the housing construction industry. This meant for them that the construction of a home was reduced to just 27 steps. Efficiency, industrial manufacturing, teachings of Fordism and Taylorism were now ingrained in the home construction industry. Needless to say, these capitalist ideals also included the white support of white supremacy, male dominance, and Christian religion as a very important cultural pillars of these new town developments. Remember the New Deal's Homeowners Loan Corporation, the ABCD grading standard that I mentioned before? Well, guess how this applied to Levittown and what it meant to its residents. Well, in order to comply and keep a B rating or even an aspiring A rating, the Levitt brothers followed the Federal Housing Agency's restrictions on race and refused to sell black and brown populations their homes. Selling to non-white people would compromise the good rating and their development and buyer desirability. And this was since African Americans and Mexicans and other sort of non-white minorities were deemed non-desirable groups that would compromise property values into a hazard rating of D. Many people at that time were interviewed whether they would welcome black populations, and the answers were very closely to, well, if I welcome black individuals to our neighborhood, our property values will begin to dwindle. So this decision, it was not only, the Levitt brothers' decision, but also the inhabitants of Levittown, made Levittown the largest all-white community in the nation. In short, Suburbia started as an all-white community, as a fully racist territorial settlement. Levittown remained an all-white community until 1957. So this is 10 years after sort of the hearings began on housing. And this was when William and Daisy Myers, a famous black couple, decided to buy a home from an existing owner, which was something that the Levitt brothers could not legally challenge. They were allowed not to sell property directly to black and Mexican and brown populations, but they could not deny the possibility of existing homeowners to sell their property to them. So the Myers move became a national headline. I mean, it was in all magazines, documentaries were being made, it was on television for many times, and it caused widespread hate displays and violent unrest among Levittown residents, but also across the nation. And the federal government had to intervene to a certain extent to protect them. 2 years before the Myers move, already in 1955, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People had sued federal mortgage agencies, which had denied 6 black veterans from purchasing homes. And many other cases like these were continuously dismissed in the courts. But despite these direct confrontations and legal efforts, the exclusion of non-white populations from suburban developments continued as common practice until 1962, when President at that time, John F. Kennedy, issued an executive order prohibiting racial discrimination in any housing developments built or bought with the assessment and assistance of the federal government, which obviously included the subsidized neighborhoods of suburbia. This act later was reinforced by the Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act, also known as the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which explicitly prohibited discrimination concerning the sale, rental, and financing on housing based on race, religion, national origin, sex, and as amended in handicap and family status. So, apart from these racist origins, suburbia was also the place where the white identity of the housewife thrived in the post-war American culture. Suburban living was based on the proliferation of the male-supported nuclear family as a social standard. The feminist scholar Silvia Federici once said, and I quote her, "The nuclear family is a social form built on a contradiction. It reproduces women, but as workers, in view of our future of daily exploitation. This is one of the reasons why it is so oppressive. It is a place where, as children, we are taught to accept the capitalist work discipline. It is also a place of unequal relations. Domestic work and domestic life are built on women's unpaid labor and the male's supervision of it. By means of the wage, capital, and the state, men are delegated the power to command women's work, which is why domestic violence has been socially accepted and is so widespread even today. The nuclear family, Federici argued, has been an instrument of desocialization, and the creation of suburbia accelerated this process. So, social isolation and the devaluing of housework as not being real work is what became one of the principles that sustained the reproduction of the early suburban culture. The unpaid social reproduction of adequate capitalist children by ready to serve apron-wearing women was the double exploitation by man and by capital that modeled the social significance of women, American women, at that time. So from an economic perspective, apart from providing unpaid labor, the capitalist modeling of women's consumption needs in the household helped also trigger a new culture of mass consumption, this time based on making housework more bearable. Automated kitchen appliances or new conceptions of kitchens appeared. Friendlier cleaning supplies were marketed. Ready-to-serve food, prepackaged food, canned food, supermarkets, furniture stores close to the suburban areas, all kinds of decoration services, home maintenance industries, plumbers, builders, people that installed, air conditioning devices and so forth. And of course, the creation of the new shopping mall. All of these encompass the local ecologies of this new lifestyle. From the position of regional and national economies, the accelerated growth of large industries and infrastructures, such as car manufacturing and highway construction, bridges, even ports, together with a destructive environmental footprint that all of this was deemed necessary to sustain the projected suburban lifestyle. So I want to pay the attention that it was not just about the local development of a specific environment, white races, patriarchal, etc., but it was about how this environment created or emphasized a different economy that was pushed by the United States over the following decades. Land speculation and development, especially in the surroundings of major metropolitan areas or large cities, and the periphery of work centers, boomed, rapidly becoming a major branch of capitalist accumulation in the American economy. This level of land speculation for private house development had never been seen before. I want to point that. As David Harvey, the Marxist geographer, pointed out in his 1985 essay on the urbanization of capital, and I quote him, "Suburbanization meant the mobilization of effective demand through the total restructuring of space as to make the consumption of the products of the auto, oil, and rubber and construction industries a necessity rather than a luxury. And this helped insulate capitalism from the threat of crisis of underconsumption. At least it did this for a few decades." Now, 21 years passed from the 1947 McCarthy hearings on housing and the signing of the Fair Housing Act of 1968. By then, suburbia, together with its racial and gender prejudice, its culture of mass consumption, its environmental destruction, and its individualistic, oil-consuming, car-centric lifestyle had become the most desirable and dominant form of urban development across the nation and soon across the world. On the other hand, the stigmatization of collective housing, public housing, affordable housing, cooperative housing, and any other housing model that wasn't private ownership of a single family home had been successfully ingrained as negative in the American psyche, and this until recent days. In my view, the damage was already done. Urban segregation was perfected, at least for a few decades. Low-income populations, mostly of color, were assigned to public housing projects at this time in city centers where labor was needed. And white elites were producing, building, and promoting suburbia in the surroundings of these cities, in manicured utopian environments, promoting ownership models and economic opportunities for the white middle classes and upper classes to be. In my next monologue, I will address what comes after the 1950s. I will focus on suburban development from the 1960s until today. And it is in these decades that we find the rise of civil rights protests, anti-war protests, feminist uprisings, environmental movements, housing riots, and many anti-suburban propositions that pushed a more sustainable and equitable form of urban growth. And all of these side to side with the white flight, the abandonment of city centers, the export of cheap labor to other countries, the continuous growth of the suburban culture, and its capitalist machine. Please stay tuned for the next episode. This was another episode of Cities After. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to subscribe.